we've told what I said on Sunday, the 29th of June. (2008), right?
Right.
Are we ready to move on?
I have to say one thing by the
Okay.
Spirit of God. If you think that one woman can preach the gospel and that's okay, and another woman can't, then you're a respecter of persons, and that's sin.
Thank God.
All right, now, where were we?
The Spirit of God said it through a woman.
Amen.
What do you want?
We were talking about July 29th.
Right.
And it was interesting because I talked to you, I can't remember if it was that morning or that night. Well, I think it was that evening. And then I went home to double check to make sure what I had told you was true.
Right.
And I went back through my papers, and yes, it was. I believed I was a descendant of the Mayflower and through Dottie. But a couple days later, then I emailed you.
Right.
And I said that, yes, it was true, and I just said that it came through the family, and that I thought it was interesting because at that time my mother's family said that their descendants had come from Jamestown, and my father's side was where the Mayflower came in. And I said, it's interesting how God put the two families together.
Right.
And since that time, I have found that I am actually a descendant of 10 of them.
Right.
And the spiritual leader of the group, the separatists, in America was William Brewster. And he is a descendant of mine. I'm also descended from Hopkins, who actually spent several years in Jamestown before he went back to England and then joined the separatists. I'm also a descendant of Dottie, who was an indentured servant at the time. And I'm also a descendant of the pilot of the boat. So, and it's interesting, the pilot of the boat, the Mayflower, came over with the separatists, and when it came time to leave for England, he decided to stay.
Glory.
Yeah, and there were several of the staff of the ship, of the crew, that decided to stay with the Pilgrims.
Y'all want to say something? Never have I ever read or heard about a group of people with more courage than the Mayflower people.
Amen.
The courage they demonstrate.
They wanted the freedom to worship God according to their conscience. In other words, according to what they believed.
Right.
And it took, like I said, it took several years for the King of England to let him go. And what's interesting, like I shared yesterday, it was 102 passengers. Only 37 of those passengers came from Holland. The rest came from England. Some of them were not even separatists, but they came over anyway. One of them was Hopkins. Hopkins was a neighbor of one of the passengers. I think it was Brewster. And he heard Brewster talk, and he thought, I've been to America. I want to go back. I want to go with you guys. And he joined them. And they wanted him to come because he already had experience over here. And Bradford was, he was not a separatist, but he was their military leader and ended up being their governor. And when they came over, you want me to just go on?
Sure, keep going.
I shared yesterday that they saw land November 2nd after 66 days at sea. They saw the land on the 11th. They actually put anchor into the harbor. But they had to find a place where they could build, where they could actually live. And it's interesting, it took them over a month. They wanted to go south because the Virginia colony that they were supposed to be part of went clear up to the Hudson River. So they thought, well, they're just going to go south and find the Hudson River. Well, they tried and they couldn't. Every time they went, the storms would come and they had to turn around and go back. They finally decided, it just may not be the will of God that we go south. And they decided we're going to have to stay in around Cape Cod. So they spent over a month. They left the ship in the harbor, and they had another smaller ship that the men took out, and it had a sail. And they were exploring the harbor. Now, this is wintertime. This is end of November. This is December. And they're looking for a place that they can actually build, that they can actually live, they can settle. And they went all around the harbor, and they finally ended up on the west side around the end of Christmas, toward Christmas. And what they found there is absolutely amazing. What they found there was an abandoned Indian village. Abandoned. Nobody was there. And Bradford writes about it. He said when they surveyed the land, they actually had fields already cleared, but abandoned. They had European buildings. People from Europe had been there, had a couple buildings. It was all abandoned. What they didn't know was the French had been there earlier to fish, and they had built some buildings. Well, they went back. They didn't stay. And this was an Indian village, and it also had Indian huts, all abandoned. And they looked in these huts, and what they found was amazing. They found corn and beans covered over, protected, and ready to eat. Well, now you've got to realize the Pilgrims didn't even bring seed to plant. They thought that they would have supplies before the spring came. They didn't even have seed to plant. If those seeds had not been in that Indian village abandoned, the Pilgrims would have starved. They'd have run out of food. And what the Pilgrims did was, the first thing they did was they got on their knees and they thanked God for the food.
Hallelujah.
They thanked God for the seed. They thanked God there were some huts already there and fields already ready for them. Already ready. God had provided a place for them to settle. And that's when they decided on Christmas Day, that's where they were going to stay. And they brought the ship over, they landed, and they got off the ship. Now, the women and the children lived all winter long on the ship. They were supposed to build buildings. But then something amazing happened. Well, before I get to that, I want to tell you about the seed. They saw the seed was to plant. They saw that they could eat some of it. But they said, even with the abandoned village, they said, we're going to replace what we take. We will replace what we take. And if any of the Indians show up that live here, we have promised them that we will return what we took. And you know what? 6 months later, they did.
Amen.
They did. But they settled there. The men started building. And then they got sick. They got sick. That winter, and it was a harsh winter. And to live on the ship was damp and cold. And the food that they ate was not fresh. It was still the same food that they brought from England. Half of them died. Half of the passengers died. Out of 18 women, 4 survived. 4. And it's interesting, a couple of my ancestors were some of the women that survived. William Brewster's wife survived. Her name was Mary. And 3 more survived, but the rest of them died. A lot of the children died, but a lot survived. 22 men only survived. But they had food. And it's amazing. They would bury them by the month. I mean, he said every 2 or 3 days, somebody died. And it was interesting. Only 2 people of all of the passengers on that ship did not get sick. William Brewster, their spiritual leader, never got sick. He spent his whole time helping everybody else. And the other one was Bradford, the military leader, never got sick, attended to the others. So they made it through the winter. They made it into March. Well, in April, they start seeing Indians. They start seeing Indians in the outskirts. You know how the Indians did not, made themselves just they saw them, but they never spoke. And they realized now they may be in trouble because now they've only got half of them and they're all weak. And they're thinking this is the best time for the Indians to attack because we can hardly defend ourselves. They'd already built a gun tower. They already had a cannon up in the tower. But that's just about all the buildings that they were going to build. They didn't get done because they were all ill. So Bradford gets as many of the men together as he can, and they start getting ready to defend themselves and the ship. And they're working on trying not to look sick, trying to build up their fortress so that they don't look weak. And in the middle of this, in April, out of nowhere, an Indian walks straight into the camp, straight up to the men, and he looks at the leaders, and he says, "Welcome, welcome, Englishmen," in English. He's speaking English. Now, what are the chances of an Indian speaking English when they are 3,000 miles away from home? And they're in a country that nobody lives, no Englishman lives. Well, this Indian, what was it? I can't remember his name. Samoset actually lived in Maine. He was an Indian from Maine, and what he was doing, and he worked with some of the Englishmen that had come over to fish. So he knew, he traded with them, so he knew a little bit of English. Well, now he's coming down to visit Massasoit, which is the chief of that area. So he's there on a visit, and then he finds these Englishmen there. So he walks into camp. Well, the Englishmen are amazed, and they're thankful. They thank God. "You sent us an Indian that speaks a little bit of English." His English was very broken, but he spent the day with them. And he sat down and he ate with them and they talked. In fact, the first thing he asked was, he said, "You got any beer? You got any beer?" That's how he knew the Englishman. So they gave him some beer. And they sat down and they talked. They spent the whole day together. He spent the night there. And he said, "I'm going to go back and talk to Massasoit." Massasoit was the chief of that whole area. 2 days later, Samoset shows up with another Indian. Now, and this Indian's name is Squanto. That's the English name for him that everybody knew him by, Squanto. Squanto is a young man, not too old. Squanto speaks almost perfect English. And Squanto, the story of Squanto is amazing. You don't think that God knew what he was going to do, and you don't think that God already had provided for them everything that they were going to need to survive in the new world. Squanto was an Indian that lived in the village that they were now living in. He was one of the survivors of the village. But what had happened was he went to England with some of the fishermen there, and he learned English. And then he came back over, and the village was still there. His family was still there. Well, he was kidnapped by the Spanish. The Spanish were also in the area fishing. And the Spanish kidnapped him and took him to Spain. And he sold him as a slave. That's what they were doing with the Indians in Spain. God gave that land to the English. If you look, the 13 colonies were English. God had provided the English for this part of the New World, and the French and the Spanish that tried to settle there couldn't. God wanted the English there. That's just God's purpose, and you can't argue with God. So this Squanto was sold as a slave in Spain. Well, the monks found him. The Spanish monks found him and decided that, you know what? He was taken illegally. So they took him back and they sent him back to England. And you know what happened when he got into England? He got the first boat he could to come over here, to come back to the New World. And when he came back to his village that he grew up in, now the Pilgrims are there, and all the people, all his family are dead. Dead. They're gone. And he talks to the Englishmen, and he makes friends with the Englishmen. They become friends. In fact, he lived with them. And he not only lived with the Englishmen, he taught them how to plant in the New World. He taught them the best places to fish. He taught them how to hunt. He taught them how to survive in the New World, because they only came from England. They had no idea how to live in the frontier. But Squanto taught them. And he was their interpreter between them and Massasoit. And for 40 plus years, Squanto and Massasoit and the people around them, the Indians, they all lived peaceably. Peaceably. And they lived in harmony, and they didn't fight. And when there was an issue, they talked to Squanto, was the interpreter. And Massasauce made a treaty with them. He said, you treat us well, we'll treat you well. And if you get attacked, we'll help you. And if we get attacked by other Indians, other Native Americans, we'd like you to help us. You see, we're told that the Englishmen came and all the Indians were friends. And that what the Englishmen did to the Indians. But that's not what history says. There were different tribes of Indians, and they were constantly at war.
Amen.
Constantly. They were at war in these United States back then. And some of the Indians would go with the English, some would go with the French, but they were constantly at war, and they were looking for Englishmen to be on their side. Because you know what? Those Englishmen had weapons that the Indians didn't have. And that's what they liked. And that's what the Pilgrims did. They helped Massasauce. They helped protect him. They worked together for almost 50 years. But you see how God provided for the Pilgrims when they were over here. They provided everything they needed. And when they got through the winter, then they provided the plants that they were to plant. And Squanto taught them how to plant. They survived. They survived. There were some other colonies that did not survive. But God was with this one, and they survived. And I'll tell you what, it was amazing. When you read their writings, they constantly thank God, constantly thank God for what he provided and for what he did for them. And it's amazing. They said that there were days without rain. They would get together, they would pray, and it would rain. There were days that they couldn't find animals to hunt. They would pray, and God would provide the animals to hunt. God provided everything that they needed, and they survived.